Hey guys, we're going to talk today about commas. This will be sort of a whirlwind tour. We've got 5 main jobs that a comma does, and I understand this will be primarily introduction. We'll have to work with this with exercises and in the class, but this will be a good sort of baseline foundation of what commas do. Broadly speaking, generally a comma separates. That's its main job. It's to separate. So when we look at these different rules that we use with commas, most of them, I think all of them maybe, have to do with some degree or particular type of separation involving syntax and grammar and word order and things like that. Um, Hang on, I'm going to try to work my pointer here. It's not working. Hold down my control key and okay, I guess I won't have a pointer for this. No biggie. Alright, let's walk through it. First rule with a comma. Items in a series. We use it to separate items in a series. Think about this as a list. If you've got any experience with particular instruction about commas, this may be one where you have a list of things, you separate it with a comma. That's pretty basic. They can be different things. Here's a list of nouns. Go buy some bananas, carrots, macaroni, and cheese for lunch. Now I use this particular example for a reason, because there's an issue with this comma after macaroni. It's called the serial comma, serial with an S, not with a C. And because it's in a series of things, we refer to it as a serial comma. Some people believe that you don't need it, that it's optional. You might have a teacher say that, or you might read that in a style guide or whatever. As far as I'm concerned, we need that comma, so for our purposes we're going to leave it in. And this sentence right here is a good example of why we might need it. If this were a list of things that I'm to go to a store and buy, my wife gives me this list. I've got 4 things on it: bananas, carrots, macaroni, cheese. 4 things. If we're saying that that comma is optional, then this might be 4 things. It might be 3 things, right? Macaroni and cheese could be 1 item. I need to know. We need to be consistent about it. So it is helpful to have it there. You drop it out and it could create confusion, right? You leave it in and you know that it's macaroni separated from cheese. You take it away, you don't know. So it's a good thing to have the serial comma, I believe. Okay, here's a series of items that are phrases. These are prepositional phrases. Our government is of the people, by the people, for the people. We're still going to separate them with commas. Here's a series of clauses. If I take notes, if I study, if I get good sleep. All of them separated by commas. And we're also, notice there's a comma before the and in the previous example a comma before the and. That's the serial comma. So if we've got 4 items, we have 3 commas. If we have 3 items, we have 2 commas. Items in a series. One more. Here's some adjectives. I've had a long, hectic, tiring day. Now there's no and in there. You don't have to have one. You could put it in. Doesn't really matter. We've got 3 items. We're separating them with 2 commas. Good. Items in a series. Pretty simple. If all items are joined by and, or nor, do not add commas. This is kind of an exception. You could have a series of things that are already separated by a conjunction like and. We walked and ran and even crawled to the finish line. Now, we do this, an author of a sentence like this is trying to emphasize something. Right? The verbs walked, ran, and crawled are made more dramatic by separating them with and rather than commas. It's just a little mechanism, dramatic mechanism. But we don't need commas there. Okay, number 2, our second use of a comma is a pretty common one. This is to separate independent clauses. Independent clauses stand alone as sentences. We're going to look for conjunctions like and, but, for, nor, so, and yet. These conjunctions separate independent clauses. Now, we know they're independent if they can stand by themselves. So in this sentence, we've got 2 ideas that could stand by themselves as sentences. I went to the store. I bought a pop. Either one of those would work as a sentence. Therefore, if we're going to join them together, we use a comma and a conjunction. Now look at this one. It's a lot like that sentence, but we're missing something. I went to the store but forgot my money. No comma. We have a conjunction. But there's no second subject, right? The verb forgot goes with the subject I at the very beginning. There's no second I in the sentence. So we only have one clause. Wherever we have a subject and a verb working together, we have a clause. we're going to refer to the clause often, so I'll probably give you a definition of that periodically. Okay, you may see this through some of the notes that we do. These are some PowerPoints that I use with my kids in school. We're using a different book, and we're sort of on a faster timetable here, so some of these exercises we're going to skip over and just kind of catch in the overall review exercises. So don't worry when you see something marked out like that. Okay, the third use of commas are to offset what are called non-essential clauses and phrases. Non-essential means it has information that's not necessary to the overall meaning of the sentence. Think of the commas as parentheses, like these. So if it's non-essential, you can think of it as being inserted in, just sort of added information, helpful information to sort of fill out the meaning a little bit more, but it's not essential to what the sentence is trying to say. Okay? We'll see that in a number of different ways in the rest of this presentation. Both of the following sentences are correct, but each has a different meaning. Punctuation depends on the intended meaning. Now, these are going to be tricky. I'll try to read them in such a way that it'll help you kind of get what the meaning is, but the punctuation is really what's going to determine the meaning. The sophomores who are going on a field trip today are assembled in the odd. There's one reading. Now we have the same sentence. I'll read it a little bit differently though. The sophomores who are going on a field trip today are assembled in the odd. Now in that second sentence you can hear the parenthetical, right? You can hear who are going on a field trip today as being inserted into the sentence to give us a little bit more information, which means that sentence is saying the sophomores are assembled in the odd. Oh, and by the way, they're going on a field trip today. You could do it that way. The first sentence is different. Who are going on a field trip today is restricting the specific sophomores. It's not all of them. Apparently, some sophomores are going on the field trip, some are staying at school. Those who are going on the field trip today are assembled in the odd. So that phrase is restrictive or essential in that first sentence. It's essential to the meaning. In the second sentence, it's non-essential, so we put commas around it. That's all that means. That'll be tricky. You need to see a number of examples of this before you really get it, so we'll practice it later. Here's another one, though. A little bit closer to home for me. My sister-in-law living in Houghton Lake is named Vicky. Now, if you're a good listener, you can assume from the way I just read that I have more than one sister-in-law, and they probably live in different towns. It sounds like I'm emphasizing a sister-in-law living in Houghton Lake. Compare that to this sentence. My sister-in-law living in Houghton Lake is named Vicky. Now if I read it that way, and you can see that there are commas around living in Houghton Lake, then you can safely assume I have one sister-in-law. She happens to live in Houghton Lake. Okay, do you see the difference between these two? One is essential, the first one. So it's essentially part of the sentence, so we don't want to separate it out. We don't want to put commas around it. Remember, commas act like parentheses in this case. That would be like chunking it out and saying, well, we could leave it in, we could take it out, doesn't really matter. The second sentence, that is the case, so we're going to put commas around it. If it's essential, don't mess with it with commas. Remember what the main job of a comma is. It's to separate. We don't want any separation when the meaning is essential to the sentence. Okay, let's move on. Number 4, we use a comma after certain introductory elements, things that come at the beginning of a sentence, like a mild exclamation. Well, I guess. Oh, look at that. Sure, we can go now. Right? Normally exclamations have exclamation points after them, but if they're mild like that, you can use commas. Now, we won't see that a lot in the kind of writing and reading that we do in this course, but more informal writing, you would use this, dialogue, creative writing. Another intro element is a participial phrase. These are phrases that they look like verbs, but they're acting as adjectives. We use them all the time. Shivering, we stood in the rain. Right? Shivering is describing we. You can hear the pause when you read these kinds of sentences. And that's a good general rule of thumb, at least to begin to think whether or not to put a comma in, is if there's an obvious pause, think comma. Now, you don't want to get into other punctuation, because other kinds of punctuation have separation too, right? Colons and semicolons and periods, those all act to separate as well. So there are other grammar rules to sort of guide us here, but a general rule to point us in the direction of a comma is the pause. Calling for a timeout, the referee whistled. You can hear the pause there. The phrase calling for a timeout is describing the referee. There's a good place for a comma. Exhausted after the race, I collapsed. Same idea there. Notice shivering, calling, exhausted. They look like verbs, don't they? They're actions. They've got ing or ed endings, but they're acting as adjectives. You might have a comma after a long series of prepositional phrases. And this is sort of a judgment call because it can flow in such a way that a comma might just create a bump there that you don't want. Or maybe you've got a long series of phrases, or the phrase just has enough meaning to it by itself that it creates a pause. This is a general rule to think about. In this case, we've got 3 prepositional phrases strung together. By the light of the moon in September, we harvested the corn. Prepositional phrases will often do that. They'll connect to each other like train cars because the end of a prepositional phrase is a noun. And nouns are modified by adjectives. And one of the 2 jobs of a prepositional phrase is an adjective. So it's typical that we attach prepositional phrases to nouns. So you end up with long strings of them like this. When they show up at the beginning of the sentence, think about putting a comma in. Notice some of these rules that we're talking about are optional. Most are not. Most of them are pretty hard and fast, but this one is optional. After an intro adverb phrase, adverb phrases begin with these adverb indicators like when, if, as, while, because, after, since. These are words that create conditions. So when you have these conditional sentences, we want commas after the intro phrase. If the dog barks, let him in. So you can hear the pause there too. He composed his first opera when he was 12 years old. Now we have the word when, which is one of those words, but it's not at the beginning. And if you read it, you don't hear a pause here, do you? He composed his first opera when he was 12 years old. This sentence flows. There's no reason to have any separation between opera and when, between those 2 chunks. However, if we flip it around, when he was 12 years old, he composed his first opera. It's hard to read that without pausing. And you want a comma there. It's an introductory adverb clause. Almost there. Okay, sorry, my PowerPoint's a little screwed up. Use commas to offset interrupters. Interrupters are things like a positive, and a positive is just a noun that names another noun. Right? We use this all the time when we're describing people. So we've got, well, in this case, it's almost a person. It's my cat. My cat, Hazel, has no tail. Hazel is an a positive naming the cat. It's naming or identifying the noun right before it. We could flip it around too. Hazel, a cat we got last year, has no tail. Or I could have just said Hazel, my cat, has no tail. A cat we got last year, or my cat, sort of inserted in there, is an a positive. It's naming Hazel. If you don't know what an a positive is and you don't get it, it doesn't really matter. It's still an interrupter. You can still tell that whatever's going in there is interrupting. It's parenthetical. It's non-essential. Whatever you want to call it. Either way, you're going to end up with commas around it. A positives don't have to interrupt. They can be essential. Like in this case, my cat Hazel is stupid, but my dog Fido is not. So Hazel is essential to the sentence. Fido is essential to the sentence. It suggests that maybe I have more than one cat, I have more than one dog. It's not just inserted in. Man, I really screwed up this PowerPoint. Sorry. We'll ignore that sentence for a little bit. Words used in direct address. Don't sleep under the car tire, Hazel. We're directly talking to Hazel, so we'll offset her name with commas. Yes, Mr. Beals, I'm writing legibly. Parenthetical expressions, but not something in actual parentheses. So there's another interrupter. This book, in fact, is overdue. Right? In fact is, we always use that parenthetically, whether it's at the beginning of the sentence or in the middle, it doesn't really matter. So we want to offset it with commas. My dog, on the other hand, is very bright. Another typical phrase that we insert as an interrupter. Okay, that's it. Those are all the uses of commas. Um, as far as which ones you're going to see on the ACT, it's kind of depends on the ACT test that you take. Oftentimes we'll run into the independent clauses issue. There's a comma that's used in when we look at semicolons. There's a comma that's used with an inserted adverbial phrase that I'll talk about later. But mostly the comma use that you'll use has to do with your writing. This is more for your essay writing. The ACT is not real big on testing this particular area of punctuation. It's much bigger with the semicolon, colon, dash. But commas are going to affect your writing like no other piece of punctuation, so we want to make sure that we get these nailed down well. Let's do this review on page 766 in the green and white textbook. Just number your paper 1 through 20. Show where the commas go. You don't need to worry about end mark punctuation. I know the instructions there say something about periods or end mark. I assume everybody knows how to use a period, a question, and an exclamation point. I'm also assuming that not everybody knows all the rules about commas, so we're focusing on commas. Just do that, and we'll call it good. Have these ready to go over next time in class. Thanks, guys.